You're here to clean. Don't touch my son." The words were not shouted. They were delivered with the flat, dismissive precision of a surgeon making an incision, separating the vital from the irrelevant. Alastair Vance didn't even turn to face her. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling window of his Manhattan penthouse, a silhouette of immense power framed against a bruised twilight sky. Below, the city glittered, a galaxy he owned. Annalise stood by the door, her hands clasped in front of her crisp, gray uniform. She had been in the apartment for less than an hour, her presence still a ghost haunting the edges of a world sealed in glass and steel. The air itself felt different here, thinner, scrubbed of any scent that might suggest life. No lingering aroma of coffee, no hint of perfume, just the sterile tang of industrial cleaner and cold money. Her gaze drifted from the man's rigid back to the small figure curled on a vast white sofa. Leo. He was 6 years old, a whisper of a child lost in acres of Italian leather. His knees were pulled to his chest, his head bent over a tablet that cast a pale, flickering light on his face. He made no sound, no movement. He was a perfect portrait of stillness, a human ornament in a room that felt more like a gallery than a home. Alastair finally turned, his eyes, the color of faded denim, sweeping over Annalise with an assessing glance that took in her uniform, her posture, her very existence, and found it all wanting. He was a handsome man, sharp-jawed and impeccably tailored, but there was a brittleness to him, as if he were holding 1,000 pieces of himself together through sheer force of will. "Mrs. Gable, the agency director, explained your duties," he continued, his tone leaving no room for misunderstanding. "They are confined to the maintenance of this residence. Dusting, polishing, vacuuming, laundry. You will receive a schedule. You are not a nanny. You are not a governess. You are not a friend." He took a step closer, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the polished marble floor. "My son is undergoing a period of adjustment. He requires a structured, non-intrusive environment. The therapists have been very clear about this. Unsolicited interaction is disruptive." Annalise finally met his gaze. Her own eyes were deep and calm, the color of rich earth after a rain. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She had learned long ago that in houses like this, silence was a currency. To speak was to risk, to reveal, to become a person, and a person could be broken. An object, however, could only be used. It was safer to be an object. "I understand, sir," she said. Her voice was low and melodic, a stark contrast to the room's harsh acoustics. He seemed momentarily surprised that she had spoken at all. A faint flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps, crossed his face before the mask of indifference slid back into place. "Good," he clipped. "His room is off limits unless explicitly scheduled for cleaning. When you are in there, you do not engage with him. He will not engage with you. He doesn't speak." The finality of that statement hung in the air, heavier than any command. He doesn't speak. It wasn't a diagnosis, it was a verdict. Alastair's phone buzzed from the granite countertop of the nearby wet bar. He turned to it, the brief, unsettling moment of human interaction already over. Annalise was dismissed, relegated back to the periphery where she belonged. She took a deep breath, the sterile air filling her lungs, and turned to her cleaning cart, a gleaming stainless steel vessel of sprays, cloths, and chemicals. This was her domain. These were her tools. Her purpose here was simple: to erase any sign that people actually lived here. Smudges from glass, dust from surfaces, footprints from floors. Her job was to maintain the illusion of perfection, to make the space as silent and empty as the child on the sofa. But as she began to polish a chrome table leg, her eyes were drawn back to Leo. He hadn't moved. The tablet in his hands was dark, the screen blank. He wasn't watching anything. He was just holding it, a shield against the vast, echoing silence of the room. He was hiding in plain sight, just like her. Would you endure this? To be seen as nothing more than a pair of hands, a function, an object to be instructed and ignored? Annalise felt a familiar ache settle in her chest, a dull, heavy stone she had carried for years. It was the ache of being misunderstood, of having a whole universe inside of you that no one ever thought to ask about. She looked at the boy, so small and lost in his father's world, and saw a reflection of her own invisibility. Alastair Vance had drawn a line, a cold, clear boundary between his world and hers. "Don't touch my son." He thought it was a simple instruction. He had no idea he was issuing a challenge to the very core of her being. He saw a maid. He didn't see the woman who knew that some things couldn't be cleaned, only healed. And healing always began with a single touch. The days settled into a rhythm of silent, meticulous work. Annalise learned the geography of the penthouse, the rooms that faced the dawn, the way the afternoon sun slanted across the west-facing library, the specific hum of the climate control system. She learned the schedules of the other staff, the private chef who only spoke to give orders, the security detail that changed with military precision, the rotating cast of tutors who spoke to Leo in loud, patronizing tones and left looking defeated. Most of all, she learned the contours of Isabella's presence. Alistair's fiancée was a whirlwind of sharp angles and expensive fabrics, a woman who moved through the apartment not as if she lived there, but as if she were perpetually staging it for a magazine shoot. She would direct Annalise with a flick of her wrist, her voice dripping with condescension. "The smudges on the glass table are simply unacceptable. Do it again. Or when you are finished in here, disappear. Alistair and I are entertaining." Annalise was not a person to her. She was a function, a pair of hands to execute commands. Would you tolerate this kind of daily erasure, to be treated as a piece of the furniture you were meant to be polishing? Through it all, Annalise watched Leo. She saw how he flinched from Isabella's brittle laughter, how he retreated deeper into himself when the tutors' voices grew too loud. He had his own silent rhythm, a map of safe spaces, under the grand piano, behind the thick velvet curtains in the library, inside the empty dumbwaiter in the kitchen hallway. He was a ghost in his own home, and only she seemed to notice. One afternoon, while she was dusting a low bookshelf in the library, she felt his presence. She didn't turn. She simply continued her slow, steady work. From the corner of her eye, she saw him standing in the doorway, watching her. Her hand was in her apron pocket, fingers wrapped around the smooth, familiar shape of the little wooden bird her grandfather had carved for her decades ago. It was a simple thing, no bigger than her thumb, its wings half spread as if caught between rest and flight. It was her one secret comfort. Slowly, deliberately, she took her hand from her pocket and placed the bird on the shelf beside a leather-bound volume of poetry. She didn't look at Leo. She simply left it there, a silent offering, and moved to the other side of the room to continue her work. She heard the soft scuff of a small shoe on the Persian rug. She risked a glance at the reflection in the glass of a framed map on the wall. Leo had crept closer. His small hand, pale and hesitant, reached out. His fingers hovered over the wooden bird, not quite touching it, as if it were a creature that might startle and fly away. For a full minute he just stood there, his attention captured by this small, handcrafted object in a home filled with priceless machine-made perfection. Then, as silently as he had appeared, he was gone. When Annalise returned to the bookshelf, the bird was still there. But she knew something had changed. A connection had been made, a silent question asked and answered. In a house of cold, hard surfaces, she had offered something warm and real, and the boy who never spoke had seen it. He had seen her. The storm arrived without warning, a furious purple bruise that swallowed the late afternoon sky. Rain lashed against the panoramic windows and the wind howled like a hungry animal. For Annalise, it was just weather. For Leo, it was the end of the world. The first clap of thunder was a cannon shot that shook the building. From the living room, Annalise heard a small, choked gasp. When she looked, the sofa was empty. Leo had vanished. Moments later, the lights flickered twice and died, plunging the penthouse into an unnerving, shadowy darkness. Panic erupted. Isabella shrieked. Alistair's voice barked orders into his phone, demanding to know why his building's backup generators hadn't kicked in. A tutor, a young man named Charles, fumbled with his own phone, its flashlight beam dancing manically across the room. "Leo?" Alistair's voice was tight with a fear he was trying desperately to control. "Leo, where are you?" They searched the common rooms, their frantic calls echoing in the dark. "He's not in the library. Check the kitchen." Isabella, utterly useless, stood by the window, complaining about her ruined evening plans. Annalise remained still, her heart aching with a certainty the others didn't possess. They were looking for a boy. She knew they needed to be looking for a hiding place. She thought of his silent map of safe spaces. Under the piano. Too open. Behind the curtains. Too obvious. She closed her eyes and listened past their shouting, trying to hear the silence where Leo would be. Then she knew. She moved quietly through the chaotic apartment, her steps sure in the darkness. She bypassed the bedrooms and the library, heading for the service corridor near the kitchen. There was a large linen closet there, deep and dark and filled with the muffled scent of fresh laundry. The door was slightly ajar. She didn't call his name. She didn't turn on a light. She simply knelt by the opening and began to hum. It was a low, gentle lullaby from her homeland, a song about a river that always found its way to the sea. It was a song of quiet perseverance, a melody that promised that all things, even fear, eventually passed. A small, ragged sob came from the darkness within. She continued to hum, her voice a steady anchor in the storm of his terror. After a moment, a small, trembling shape emerged from behind a stack of towels. It was Leo. His face was pale and tears streaked in the faint emergency light from the hallway. He looked at her, his breathing shallow and fast. She didn't reach for him. She just kept humming, her presence a calm, unwavering invitation. He hesitated, then took a stumbling step forward, and then another. He crawled the last few feet and collapsed into her lap, burying his face in her apron, his small body shaking with spent terror. Annalise wrapped her arms around him, holding him securely. It was the first time she had disobeyed her employer's command. It was the first time she had held the boy. It felt less like a transgression and more like a homecoming. That was how Alistair Vance found them. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing on the two figures on the floor. He stopped dead, his frantic energy dissolving into stunned silence. He saw the maid he had ordered to be invisible, holding the son he couldn't reach. He saw his child, not screaming or hiding, but clinging to this woman as if she were the only solid thing in the world. The beam wavered in his hand. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. What could he say? The rules he had established had shattered. The sterile, controlled environment he had fought to maintain was breached, and in its place was this, a scene of such profound, quiet comfort that it felt like an accusation. If that were your child, what would you do next? Alistair never spoke of the incident in the linen closet. The next morning, the power was restored, the storm had passed, and the household resumed its sterile rhythm as if nothing had happened. He didn't fire Annalise. He didn't reprimand her. He simply ignored her, a feat that now required a visible effort. Acknowledging her would mean acknowledging his own failure, and Alistair Vance was not a man who trafficked in failure. But Annalise knew a door had been unlocked. She didn't push it open, but she allowed a little light to creep through the crack. She began a campaign of quiet care, a series of small, almost imperceptible gestures aimed at the silent boy. She started leaving the little wooden bird in new places for him to discover each day. One morning, he'd find it perched on the globe in the library, its tiny beak pointing toward the Caribbean. The next, it would be nestled among the fruit in the kitchen's centerpiece bowl. It became a silent game between them, a thread of connection woven through the cold tapestry of the penthouse. She hummed her lullaby often now, a soft, ambient sound that followed her as she worked. It was never directed at him, but it was for him. It was a presence, a warmth that filled the spaces where words were absent. She noticed him pausing when he heard it, his shoulders losing a fraction of their tension. Alistair noticed, too. He would watch from the doorway of his home office, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. He saw his son, who for months had done nothing but stare blankly at a screen, now moving through the apartment with a quiet purpose, searching for the little wooden bird. He saw Leo pick up a crayon. One afternoon, Alistair walked into the sunroom to find a piece of paper on the table. It was a child's drawing, clumsy but clear. It showed a small, brown bird with oversized wings. Beside it, another figure was sketched, a woman in a gray dress with a kind, simple smile. He picked up the paper, the cheap copy paper feeling alien in his hands. It had been nearly a year since Leo had drawn anything. His therapists had tried art therapy, music therapy, play therapy. a dozen expensive clinical approaches that had yielded nothing but frustration. Yet here was this drawing, proof of a breakthrough achieved not by a high-priced specialist, but by a maid who hummed and carried a wooden bird in her pocket. It was a quiet, undeniable display of competence that completely upended his worldview. He had hired Analyze to erase messes, but it seemed her true skill was in revealing what was hidden underneath. He didn't know whether to be grateful or furious, so he chose to be silent, folding the drawing and slipping it into his jacket pocket, a secret he wasn't yet ready to understand. The invisible thread between Analyze and Leo grew stronger, becoming a rope only they could see. He started to shadow her as she went about her duties, always keeping a respectful distance of 10 feet, a silent, orbiting moon to her quiet planet. If she polished the brass fixtures in the foyer, he would sit on the bottom step of the grand staircase, watching. If she folded laundry in the utility room, he would appear in the doorway, a small, watchful guardian. He never spoke. He never had to. His presence was a language all its own. One sun-drenched afternoon, Analyze was cleaning the enormous glass doors that led to the terrace. Leo was sitting on the floor nearby, holding the wooden bird. He ran his thumb over its smooth, carved wings, again and again. Analyze worked with her back to him, the squeak of her cloth on the glass a rhythmic counterpoint to the city's distant hum. "Chi-RP," a small voice whispered. Analyze froze, her hand stilling on the glass. The word was raspy, hesitant, as if formed from dust and disuse. She didn't turn around. She didn't react. She held her breath, giving the moment space to exist, terrified that any sudden movement would shatter it. Leo said it again, a little louder this time, filled with a 6-year-old's pride of discovery. "Chirp." He was looking at the bird in his hands, giving a name to the feeling it evoked. Analyze felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling so potent it almost brought her to her knees. It was the sound of a key turning in a lock that everyone had said was rusted shut. She finished her work on the doors and, without a word, moved on to the next room, leaving him to his discovery. Later that day, the pivotal moment arrived. Alistair came home early from a meeting, striding into the living room with his jaw tight, clearly agitated about some corporate battle. Analyze was there, replacing a vase of flowers on a side table. Leo was on the sofa, clutching the bird. "I need the quarterly reports on my desk in 5 minutes," Alistair said, not looking at anyone in particular. The command simply fired into the room. Leo slid off the sofa. He walked past his father, a man radiating so much tension he was practically vibrating, and went straight to Analyze. He tugged gently on the hem of her apron. She looked down at him, her expression soft and questioning. Leo held up the wooden bird toward her, a gesture of offering, of communion. Then he looked up at her face and, in a voice that was shockingly clear and steady, said her name. "Analyze." Alistair froze mid-stride. The name echoed in the cavernous room, a sound so unexpected it seemed to defy the laws of physics. He turned slowly, his face a canvas of disbelief. He stared at his son, who was looking up at the maid with an expression of perfect, uncomplicated trust. Then he looked at Analyze, who was simply smiling down at the boy. For the first time in over a year, his son had spoken a person's name, and it was not his, it was hers. The silence that followed was deafening, filled with 1,000 unspoken questions. The world had just tilted on its axis, and Alistair Vance was no longer sure which way was up. If you were there, would you step closer or stay silent? The sound of his son speaking her name became a splinter in Alistair's mind. It was a miracle he couldn't claim, a victory he hadn't earned. It gnawed at him, a complex cocktail of awe, jealousy, and profound confusion. He began to watch Analyze with a new, unsettling intensity. He saw the way Leo's eyes followed her, the way a sense of calm settled over a room when she entered it. He saw the bond, and it terrified him. Isabella saw it too, but her interpretation was far simpler and infinitely more venomous. She saw a threat. She cornered Alistair in his office one evening, her voice a low, conspiratorial hiss. "You see it, don't you, darling, how he follows her around like a puppy?" Alistair stood by the window, staring down at the river of headlights on the street below. "He's getting better, Bella. The therapists are thrilled." "Oh, please," she scoffed, stepping behind him and placing her hands on his shoulders, her lacquered nails like tiny red claws. "The therapists have nothing to do with this. It's her. She's done something." "What are you suggesting?" he asked, his voice weary. "It's a classic play, Alistair. The vulnerable child, the indispensable caregiver. She's making him dependent on her. She's worming her way into his affections to make herself essential. It's a power move, a way to secure her position." The accusation was ugly, a poison designed to contaminate the one pure good thing that had happened in months. Yet a part of Alistair, the cynical, calculating part that had built an empire, found it plausible. In his world, every action had a motive, every relationship was a transaction. Kindness without an angle was a foreign concept. "She's a maid, Bella," he said, though his defense sounded weak even to himself. "And she's a smart one," Isabella pressed, sensing her advantage. She saw an opportunity and she took it. "She's manipulating a traumatized child for job security. It's grotesque, and it's unprofessional. What will people say when they find out the Vance heir only speaks to the help? It undermines everything we're trying to do, everything you're trying to do." She had found his weak spot, his obsession with control and public perception. The social trap was sprung. If he defended Analyze, he appeared weak, naive, and unable to manage his own household. If he sided with Isabella, he would be destroying the very connection that was healing his son. He was caught between what his eyes could see, a gentle woman healing a broken boy, and what his world had taught him to believe, that everyone had an angle. The trap wasn't just about Analyze's job. It was a trap for his soul. Isabella was forcing him to choose between the cold logic that had made him a billionaire and the burgeoning hope that Analyze had quietly planted in his home. His fiancée's words, slick and poisonous, began to work on him, turning that hope into a suspicion, a liability. The decision was an act of cowardice. Alistair chose the familiar poison over the unfamiliar cure. He chose control over connection. He chose to protect his perfectly curated world, even if it meant destroying his sons. He called Analyze into the library, the same room where he had first seen Leo's drawing of the bird. The room felt cold, the evening light casting long prison bar shadows across the floor. "Analyze," he began, his voice stiff and formal. He couldn't bring himself to look at her. "Your services are no longer required." Analyze stood before his massive oak desk, her hands clasped, her face calm. She didn't ask why. She didn't protest. She simply absorbed the blow with a quiet dignity that was more unnerving than any outburst would have been. Her silence was a mirror, and in it, Alistair saw his own weakness reflected. "There are concerns," he continued, the words feeling like ash in his mouth, "about professional boundaries. About the formative nature of your relationship with my son. It is felt that a more clinical approach is for the best." He was parroting Isabella's words, and they sounded hollow and absurd in the quiet room. For the best. He was firing the only person who had ever gotten through to his child, and he was calling it for the best. "I see," Analyze said, her voice even. "May I have a moment to say goodbye to him?" "No," Alistair said, the word coming out sharper than he intended. "A clean break is less disruptive." He was a fool. He was severing a lifeline and calling it a clean break. Analyze gave a single slow nod. "As you wish, sir." She turned and left the library. A few minutes later, the head of security escorted her to the service elevator, her final paycheck and a non-disclosure agreement in an envelope. Before she left her small staff locker, she took the wooden bird from her apron. She couldn't keep it. It didn't belong to her anymore. Her last act in the penthouse was to slip unnoticed into Leo's room. He was asleep, his face peaceful for once. She placed the small, carved bird on his pillow, right beside his cheek. A silent, final gift. A piece of her heart left behind. What would you sacrifice to stay true to what you know is right? Analyze had sacrificed her livelihood to protect a child's heart. Now, Alistair was about to discover the cost of his own choice. That night, the screaming started. It was a raw, animal sound of pure anguish. Alistair and Isabella rushed to Leo's room to find him standing in the middle of the floor, his face contorted in a mask of grief. He wasn't looking at them. He was looking at the empty space on his pillow where the bird had been, which he now clutched in his hand. He backed away from them, his eyes wide with terror and betrayal. Then, with a cry that tore through the soul of the penthouse, he picked up a heavy glass paperweight from his desk and hurled it at the window. It didn't break through, but a spiderweb of cracks radiated from the point of impact, fracturing the perfect view of the city into 1,000 broken pieces. The illusion of their perfect world was shattered. Days bled into a week of hell. The penthouse, once a sanctuary of controlled silence, became a prison of raw grief. Leo retreated into a state of shutdown so profound, it eclipsed everything that had come before. He refused to eat. He refused to sleep. He sat on the floor of his room, clutching the wooden bird, rocking back and forth, a low, guttural moan the only sound he made. The expensive therapists came and went, their faces grim. Isabella tried to placate him with expensive toys which he threw against the wall. Alistair tried to speak to him, his voice cracking with a desperation he could no longer hide, but Leo looked through him as if he were glass. The night of the Vance Foundation Gala arrived. It was the biggest philanthropic event of the year, a night where Alistair was set to unveil a massive new global literacy initiative. It was supposed to be a triumph. Instead, it felt like a funeral. He stood in his tuxedo, adjusting his bow tie in the mirror, and saw the reflection of a hollowed-out man. Isabella was beside him, radiant in a diamond necklace, chattering about the guest list. "The mayor is at our table, darling. You simply must be on your game tonight." He barely heard her. His mind was upstairs, in the silent, grieving room. A nanny hired for the evening was with Leo, under strict instructions not to let him out of her sight. The gala was a glittering, soul-crushing affair. Alistair moved through the crowd, shaking hands, smiling for cameras, his face an expertly crafted mask, but his heart was a lead weight in his chest. During the main course, his phone vibrated. It was the nanny, her voice was trembling. "Mr. Vance, I can't find him. I just turned my back for a second and he was gone. He's not in his room. He's not anywhere." Alistair's blood ran cold. He excused himself from the table, his face pale. He raced upstairs, the sound of polite applause from the ballroom fading behind him. The penthouse was empty. His security team was already sweeping the building, their voices crackling over their earpieces. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. He had lost millions in the market and never felt a fear like this. He had lost his son. He stood in the center of the living room, his mind racing, checking off all the logical places, the known hiding spots. Nothing. It was then, in the absolute pit of his despair, that he realized there was only one person in the world who might know where his son was. His hands shook as he pulled out his phone and found her number in his call history. He pressed the button, his pride turning to dust. She answered on the second ring. "Hello." Her voice was calm, a pool of stillness in his raging panic. "Analyze," he choked out, the name a plea. "It's Alistair Vance. Leo, he's gone. We can't find him." There was a pause on the other end of the line. He could hear the faint sound of a television. She wasn't angry. She wasn't triumphant. She was just listening. "He's not gone, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice gentle. "He's just somewhere you've never thought to look. Go to the kitchen. There's a service elevator, the old dumbwaiter. Check inside." Alistair stared at his phone, his mind reeling. The dumbwaiter. A small, dark box he hadn't even realized was still functional. He sprinted to the kitchen, wrenched open the small metal door, and shone his phone's flashlight inside. There, curled into a tight ball in the cramped, dusty space, was Leo. He was clutching the wooden bird and humming. He was humming Analyze's lullaby to himself. Relief so powerful it buckled Alistair's knees, washed over him. He reached in, his hands trembling, and gently lifted his son out. Alistair carried Leo back towards the gala, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew he should take his son back upstairs, away from the noise and the people. But a different, desperate instinct took over. He couldn't let Analyze go. Not again. He sent a text to his head of security. "Find Analyze. Get her here. Now." He didn't know what he was going to do, only that he couldn't do it alone. He arrived at the edge of the grand ballroom just as the cue and a session with the press was starting. He held Leo close, the boy's face buried in his shoulder. He saw his security chief give him a nod from the wings. Analyze was there, standing just out of sight, still in her simple home clothes. Her presence was a quiet anchor, A sharp-voiced journalist from the Times stood up. "Mr. Vance, a question if I may. Your new initiative focuses on giving a voice to the underprivileged. It's a noble goal. But critics say that, for all your talk of family values, you've become increasingly disconnected from your own. How do you respond to that?" The question was a dagger, and it found its mark. The air in the ballroom grew thick with tension. All eyes turned to Alastair, standing at the edge of the room with his silent son in his arms. Flashbulbs began to pop, a series of blinding, intrusive explosions. The noise and the lights were too much for Leo. He began to squirm, a low whimper escaping his lips. He pushed against his father's chest, his eyes wide with panic. "It's okay, son. It's okay," Alastair whispered, but his words were useless. Leo twisted out of his arms, landing on his feet on the polished stage. For a moment he stood frozen, a small, terrified figure trapped in the glare of 100 spotlights. Then his eyes scanned the crowd, searching, desperate. He looked past the tables of billionaires and politicians, past the reporters, past his own father. He looked into the wings, and he saw her. A look of pure, unadulterated relief washed over his face. He took a breath, and with the strength of a tidal wave, he ran. He ran across the stage, his small feet pounding on the wood, a blur of motion toward the one safe harbor he knew in the world. He didn't slow down until he collided with Annalise's legs, wrapping his arms around her waist as if he might never let go. The room, which had been buzzing with murmurs, fell into a profound, shocked silence. Everyone, the media, the donors, Isabella, Alastair, stared at the scene. The billionaire's son, clinging to a woman no one recognized. Then, Leo tilted his head back, looked up at Annalise's face, and in a voice that was not a whisper, but a clear, ringing declaration that carried to every corner of the vast ballroom, he said the one word that changed everything. "Mama." The cameras exploded. The sound was a deafening roar of clicks and flashes. Isabella's face went white with horror. Alastair stood rooted to the spot, the journalist's question about family hanging in the air, answered more devastatingly than any soundbite could have. He felt the entire foundation of his life crumble to dust. The power, the control, the narrative, it was all gone. It had been transferred in a single, shattering moment to the quiet woman in the gray dress who was now stroking his son's hair. Did you feel that shift? The world had not just tilted. It had been turned upside down. The next morning, the word "Mama" was on the front page of every newspaper and gossip site. The photograph of Leo clinging to Annalise was everywhere, a stark, powerful image that told a story of neglect and desperate love. The Vance Foundation's triumphant gala had become a public relations catastrophe. For Alastair, however, it was something else entirely, a reckoning. The public humiliation was nothing compared to the private one. He had seen the truth on a public stage, and it had broken him open. His first act was to end things with Isabella. There was no argument. She saw the look in his eyes and knew the game was over. She packed her things and was gone within the hour, a ghost of a future that had evaporated overnight. His second act was much harder. He drove to a modest, walk-up apartment building in a part of the city he'd only ever seen from his helicopter. He climbed 4 flights of stairs and knocked on Annalise's door. When she opened it, he didn't see a maid. He saw the woman who held his son's heart in her hands. She wasn't surprised to see him. She simply waited. He started, his voice thick. "I'm sorry." The words were inadequate, a pebble thrown into a canyon of wrongdoing, but they were all he had. "I'm sorry for firing you, for not listening, for not seeing. I was a blind, arrogant fool." He looked past her into the small, clean apartment. It was humble, but it felt more like a home than his sterile penthouse ever had. There were plants on the windowsill and a half-finished knitted blanket on a chair. "I don't want to offer you your job back," he said, his voice dropping. "That's not what this is. I'm here to ask for your help. I don't know my own son, Annalise. I don't know how to reach him. You do. Please teach me." It was the first time in his adult life Alastair Vance had ever asked for anything he couldn't buy. Annalise looked at him, her gaze steady and searching. She was not looking at a billionaire. She was looking at a father who had finally realized he was failing. What does real justice look like here? Is it revenge? Is it retribution? Or is it the quiet, difficult work of rebuilding what was broken? She saw the genuine remorse in his eyes, the terror of a man who had everything and was on the verge of losing the only thing that mattered. "Come in, Mr. Vance," she said softly, stepping aside. "Let's talk about Leo." The conversations that followed were not about employment, they were about philosophy. Annalise spoke, and for the first time, Alastair listened. She spoke of patience, of observing without judgment, of creating safety before demanding connection. She talked about the language of silence, and how a child's behavior is not a problem to be managed, but a story to be understood. Alastair, the man who closed multi-billion-dollar deals, took notes like a first-year student. He was humbled, stripped of his usual arrogance, and remade by the simple, profound wisdom of this woman he had once dismissed. He didn't just want her to teach him, he wanted to amplify her voice. "What you're describing," he said one afternoon, this approach, it should be a model. It could help thousands of children like Leo." Annalise agreed, but on one condition. "It cannot be another cold clinical program, Mr. Vance. It must be built on empathy. It must value the caregivers as much as the children." And so, a systemic change began. Alastair, using his immense resources, established a new, independent wing of the Vance Foundation. It wasn't just named, it was given a mission. It was called the Quiet Voices Initiative. Its charter was to fund and develop programs centered on non-verbal communication and trauma-informed care for children. The core policy was revolutionary for the world of institutional philanthropy. Every program funded had to include mandatory training and mental health support for parents and caregivers. The rule, which became known as the Annalise Principle, stipulated that you could not heal a child without first supporting the person who held them. Annalise was not given a fancy title or a seat on the board. She refused them. Instead, she took the role of senior advisor, the architect of the curriculum. She worked with psychologists and educators to translate her intuitive methods into a replicable, teachable framework. The woman who had been hired to mop floors was now redesigning the very architecture of childhood healing for one of the world's largest foundations. The change was quiet, but it was permanent. The institutional change was mirrored by a personal one. Annalise began spending afternoons at the penthouse, not as a maid but as a bridge between a father and a son who were strangers to one another. One rainy Saturday, the three of them were in the living room. The cavernous space, once so cold, now felt different. There were Leo's drawings taped to the wall, a half-finished Lego castle on the floor. It was messy. It was alive. Leo was sitting on the rug, focused on his sketchbook. Alastair sat awkwardly on the sofa, watching him, a familiar look of helpless uncertainty on his face. Annalise sat down on the floor, not far from Leo. She didn't say anything. After a moment, she began to hum her lullaby, the melody a soft, warm blanket in the quiet room. Leo looked up, a small smile touching his lips. "I don't know the words," Alastair said quietly from the sofa, his voice filled with a surprising vulnerability. "You don't need to know the words," Annalise replied gently. "You only need to know the feeling. It is a song about finding your way home." She looked at him. "Try." Alastair hesitated, a flush creeping up his neck. He was a man who commanded boardrooms, who spoke to audiences of thousands, but the thought of humming a lullaby in his own living room terrified him. He took a breath and then, in a voice that was clumsy and slightly off-key, he began to hum along with her. It was a broken, imperfect sound. But it was real. Leo stopped drawing. He looked up, his head tilted. He watched his father, this powerful, intimidating man, making himself vulnerable, trying to learn his son's language. Slowly, Leo pushed his sketchbook across the rug toward him. On the page was a new drawing, a large stick figure with its arms open wide, standing next to a smaller one. Alastair stopped humming, his eyes filling with tears. He looked at Annalise, his expression one of profound, unspoken gratitude. She simply nodded, a quiet affirmation that this was the work. This was the healing. It wasn't in the galas or the grants. It was here in this one fumbling, beautiful moment. The official launch of the Quiet Voices Initiative was a deliberately understated affair. There was no glittering gala, no red carpet. It was held in a renovated community center, filled with therapists, educators, parents, and children. Alastair Vance stood at a simple wooden podium to give the opening remarks. The man who took the stage was not the same man from the gala months before. The brittle arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet humility. He spoke about the Foundation's new direction, about the importance of listening to the stories that are told without words. He spoke of his own failures as a father, his own journey from blindness to sight. He never once mentioned Analyze by name. He didn't have to. "We learned," he said, his voice steady and clear, "that the most important work is often done in the quietest moments. It is done not by experts with theories, but by people with patience. It is done through consistency, through empathy, and through a quiet love that expects nothing in return. We learned that the person who can heal a family may not be the one you see on a stage, but the one you failed to see in your own home." As he spoke, his eyes found her. Analyze was standing at the back of the room, near the doors, holding Leo's hand. She wore a simple blue dress, not a uniform. She wasn't seeking the spotlight, she had never wanted it. Her reward was not in the applause which was now filling the room. Her reward was the small hand squeezed in hers, and the sight of a father who had finally, truly, come home to his son. It was recognition done right, a tribute not to a hero but to a healer. And in that moment, a door opened for 1,000 other quiet healers just like her. Years passed. The Quiet Voices initiative flourished, becoming a global model for empathetic care. The penthouse on the top floor of Manhattan became a home, filled with the normal, happy chaos of life. Leo was 16 now, a tall, thoughtful young man who had found his voice, not just for speaking, but for advocating. He was the youth ambassador for the foundation, and that evening he was scheduled to give the keynote address at their annual youth summit. He stood backstage, pacing back and forth, smoothing the lapels of his first real suit. He was nervous, the familiar flutter of stage fright in his stomach. Alistair came up behind him and put a hand on his shoulder. "You'll be great, son." "My hands are sweating," Leo said with a shaky laugh. "I have something that might help," Alistair said. He opened his palm. Resting in the center was the small wooden bird. Its surface was worn smooth with time, the dark wood polished to a soft sheen by years of being held by anxious hands. Leo looked at the bird, and a wave of memory and affection washed over him. He took it from his father, its familiar weight a comfort in his hand. A friend from the youth council came over. "What's that?" Leo looked down at the object, a symbol of his own journey. "It was a gift. From Analyze," he said, the name still holding a sacred space in their family. "She gave it to me when words were impossible, when I couldn't speak for myself." He closed his hand around it, the smooth wood warming against his skin. "Now, it reminds me why I do." "Did the object's meaning change for you too?" The little bird, once a secret token of silent comfort, a symbol of a bond forged in a world of loneliness, had transformed. It was no longer about silence. It was about the voice that comes after. It was a totem of advocacy, a reminder that the journey to being heard often begins with someone being willing to listen to the silence first. Leo walked onto the stage, the bird a quiet, powerful weight in his pocket, ready to speak. The final scene is not of a speech or an award or a newspaper headline. It is a quiet moment, years later. Alistair Vance is in his home office, the skyline of New York a familiar backdrop. He's older now, his hair graying at the temples, the lines on his face softened by time and happiness. He's finishing up a video call, laughing about something with a colleague. As he ends the call, his eyes drift to a photograph on his desk. It's the only one there. It has replaced the photos of him with world leaders and celebrities. It's not a formal portrait. It's a candid shot, taken in a sun-dappled park. In the photo, a teenage Leo is in the middle of a belly laugh, his head thrown back. Alistair is beside him, an arm around his shoulders, a genuine, unforced smile on his face. And on Leo's other side is Analyze. She is not in uniform. She is wearing a soft yellow sundress, her face radiant with joy, her hand resting lightly on Leo's arm. They are not an employer and his advisor and his son. They are simply a family. The legacy wasn't the foundation, as successful as it was. It wasn't the money or the buildings that bore his name. The legacy was this quiet, unshakable joy, the healed relationship captured in a single sunlit frame. It was the testament to a woman who entered a cold, broken house, and with nothing more than her quiet dignity and unwavering empathy, taught its inhabitants how to love. Alistair picks up the frame, his thumb gently tracing the outline of Annalise's smiling face. The room is quiet. The work is done. The family is whole. Sometimes the most profound changes don't arrive with a thunderclap, do they? They arrive with a hummed lullaby in a dark room,